Welcome to Best Evidence. I'm John Titus. In a minute, I'm going to roll a pre-recorded virtual video presentation that I give to a symposium in Sweden called On Guard for the Liberty of Mankind. It's going to air September 30th, 2023, and I speak in that talk about the very serious threat of inflation based on a paper presented at this year's Jackson Hole, Wyoming conference hosted by the Kansas City Federal Reserve. And during my talk over the course of 22 minutes, I do that. It's really not enough time to cover that topic, of course, but the kind of talent show format of these symposiums where you get this sort of shotgun blast of speakers crammed into just a few hours dictates and ends up with a very small time slot. And I went over my time slot by 7 minutes. It's supposed to be 15 minutes. That said, I've done a number of these symposium pre-records, and this is the first one that I'm putting out on multiple channels. It may be rushed, yeah, and it's got flaws, true, but I feel like it hits enough solid points that it does clear sort of my personal Mendoza line. So I'm going to go ahead and put it out there, warts and all. Plus, really, I haven't done a video in a while, so I'm just letting this one fly. Take it easy on the warts. And it has been a while since my last video, which brings up the topic of contributions. I want to thank people who contributed to my channel from the innermost parts of my being. It really means a lot to me, a lot more than you know. And if you have not gotten your thank you card yet, just sit tight. You will. I've been kind of busy wrapping up the summer here. Your contributions have made a huge difference to me, and they led to really a wellspring of ideas and means for delivering new content. So stay tuned. Links to this symposium I spoke at and everything else are in the description box below. Thank you for watching, and I will see you soon as I get back into it now that I'm done traveling and the summer is winding down. It's almost over. Take care, everyone. I'll see you. Good afternoon in Sweden. Good morning in the U.S. It is a pleasure to be speaking at the On Guard for Liberty Symposium. My name is John Titus. I have a video channel called Best Evidence. You can find it on YouTube, Odyssey, BitChute, and Rumble. I also co-host and co-produce a podcast called Money and Markets with Catherine Austin Fitz at Solari.com. On both of these venues, I cover legal and financial issues. And the title of my talk today is The Federal Reserve's Perfect Plan for U.S. Dollar Oblivion. The Fed just hosted its most important conference of the year in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, where research papers are presented, and sometimes those papers are really plans for the future. If you'll recall, at 2019 Jackson Hole, BlackRock presented a paper called Dealing with the Next Downturn, which, as it turned out, detailed the Fed's exact and quite novel response to the pandemic just a few months before the pandemic showed up, and the Fed implemented BlackRock's plan. I did a whole video on this called Larry and Carson's Excellent Pandemic, which you can find at my channel. You're looking at the thumbnail right here, so it's easy to find. But the takeaway here is that the scheme you see in Jackson Hole papers can sometimes have a very strange way of turning into reality, and that's what I want to talk about today. There is a paper at this year's Jackson Hole conference that has all the earmarks of a blueprint for what the Fed is going to do next, and that's to create even more inflation than it's already created. What's so curious about the Jackson Hole paper I want to tell you about is that it studiously avoids the word inflation. So I'm going to need to go into some historical background that's on point. And when I do, you are going to see that the plan set forth in this paper is literally the perfect instrument of inflation. The paper I'm talking about is called, boringly, Resilience Redux in the U.S. Treasury Market by Darrell Duffy. He is a professor in the Graduate School of Business, so those are the credentials the Fed is probably going to hide behind once this paper gets implemented. But let's zoom in and take a look. And what he is talking about here in the abstract is the U.S. Treasury market in March of 2020 during the pandemic, and a dash for cash. And the problem back then, according to Duffy, is that the U.S. Treasury market was limited by dealer balance sheets that are not sufficiently large. Okay, so that's a lot of jargon to be sure, but as a threshold question, why is he talking about something that happened 3 years ago? Why is that relevant now? The short answer is there is a trend in large U.S. fiscal deficits, which means that the problem that arose in March of 2020 is going to come back and haunt the U.S. Treasury market in very short order. The U.S. Treasury market, of course, being tied at the hip to U.S. deficits. But don't worry, Duffy assures us, I have approaches for backstopping Treasury market liquidity, so everything's going to be okay. That is the essence of his paper. Like I say, there's a lot of jargon and history embedded in that paper. So let's unpack it so we can see what's really at issue here. And let's start with this trend in U.S. fiscal deficits, backstopping Treasury market liquidity. The trend in U.S. deficits, if you're like me, there's really no surprise here. The trend in deficits is always up. So what possible trend could be raising an alarm here for Duffy? You won't really find the answer in this paper. You will find it in the most recent annual U.S. Treasury report for fiscal year 2022. Let's just go right to the heart of the matter. This is chart 5, and it concerns really deficits. The trend he's talking about is the total spending, which is going to drive up deficits and debt. Total spending, as you can see, begins to ramp up as a percent of GDP starting in 2022 when the Fed starts raising interest rates. And indeed, you can see that the entirety of this ramp is net interest on the federal debt. Right now, the total interest payment on the U.S. debt is, $400 billion or so. But you can see that it's going to reach 10% of GDP in short order. And if it did in today's dollars, that would be a $3 trillion problem of new treasuries that's going to have to find a home. Somebody's going to have to buy those to finance the U.S. deficit. And Duffy knows full well there is no way that the U.S. financial system can absorb the volume of U.S. treasuries, new U.S. treasuries that's coming online just to pay the interest on the debt. That's just an insane problem. Right now, the total debt as a percent of GDP isn't really so bad. You can see here it's sitting at 97% as a percent of GDP. But in a few years, we're going to see 200, 300. The total debt is going to go up to huge multiples of the entire U.S. GDP. Note, right now that we are not sitting at the historical high in terms of debt as a percentage of GDP. That distinction belongs to the year 1946, right after World War II. Keep that era in mind. We are coming back to it. But to be sure, exploding U.S. interest payments are going to quickly find stress points in the U.S. financial system. This is going to be a real problem, and that takes us back to Duffy. Okay, Duffy tells us as a reminder, U.S. Treasury market is limited by dealer balance sheets that are not sufficiently large. Okay, I'll bite. What does that mean? To answer that, we need to go to the post-war record in the U.S. because not only did we face the same huge debt problem as we have today, which we just saw, but the discussion back then is far more lucid than discussions you find today. And that's because not only were leaders back then more forthright, they actually knew a lot more too, or pretty much just smarter, which makes the historical record back at that time just invaluable. And specifically back in March of 1947, the U.S. House of Representatives held a 3-day hearing to discuss ways to handle the huge debt moving through the financial pipeline, which is pretty much the same problem we have now. The difference being that back then we had a world war and we had manufacturing to dig our way out of debt. And now all we have is basically a regional war so far in financial trickery, financial engineering, which is what Duffy is proposing and which is what is going to end in disaster. So let's go to the historical record that can help us make sense of Duffy's plan, starting with the notion of dealers. This is a 1947 testimony we are looking at right now. Most of it, pretty much all of it, I'm going to read, comes from then Federal Reserve Chairman Mariner Eccles, who was from Utah. And the Federal Reserve Building in D.C. is actually named after him. He was a smart cookie, I can tell you that. Here he is explaining what dealers are, so let's zoom in and see what he has to say. he tells us quite candidly, the Federal Reserve System buys securities from no one else but the government bond dealers. So there you have it. What he is talking about, the reason for this, is that there was a legal ban in place back then. It's also in place now that prevents the Fed from buying directly from the government. It's got to go through the bond dealers instead. The only difference really back then is that the Fed now has a list of primary dealers, 24 or 25 of them. Back then, the crony system was more informal than it is now, but the same situation obtained back then, which is that those bond dealers have a monopoly that is very profitable for their operations, and that Eccles is quite candid about his displeasure with the situation because he knows what the real purpose of banning direct purchases by the Fed is, and he tells us about it. Here we go. This is from his opening statement, also in 1947. We need to scroll down a bit. And he tells us flat out, here we go, about all that such a ban means is that in making such purchases, a commission has to be paid to government bond dealers. So the whole purpose of the ban is to insert the dealers between the Fed and the government just so the dealers get a commission. It is a straight up giveaway to crony insiders. That's all that it is. And that's important to know because it shows you that the number one priority of central banks is crony insiders. At best, the public is priority number two. So fundamentally, central banks are about making the public pay a skim to insiders rather than what's doing best for the public. Okay? And so now that that's clear, let's go back to the Duffy paper. As he said, the U.S. Treasury market is limited by dealer balance sheets because they are not sufficiently large. The problem with this contention is that Duffy never puts a dollar figure on the size of the balance sheet, so it is hard to assess this claim. However, he does cite a Fed paper that does give the dollar amount, so let's turn to that. He cites the Financial Stability Report from the Fed in May of 2020, a couple months after the liquidity squeeze in March, and we're looking for the dollar figure. That actually appears a few pages down, page 30. There's a graph of dealer inventory. Let's punch in on that so we can see it. The black line here is Treasury inventory at the dealers. It's cast in terms of percent, up to 70%. And you can see that the dealer inventory begins to run into problems. It really tops out at about $250 billion. And then the problem goes away as the Fed comes in and begins making large asset purchases. And those purchases occurred really in the second half of March and April and ongoing. But the big bulk of purchases was in March of April. Okay. Notice something else about this graph, though, which is that dealer inventory tops out on about, say, March 10th. Meaning this, the dealer inventory glut that was solved by the Fed coming in with asset purchases, that began in February. Okay. The upshot here is that the Fed's ability to point to the pandemic on March 10th, rather than to the frailty in the crony dealer system, which manifested itself in February, was a lucky break for the Fed, because the Fed could point to the pandemic rather than to the frailty in the crony dealer system as an excuse for buying all the assets that it bought. Suffice it to say that it was a very conveniently timed pandemic to arrive for the Fed. Let's just leave it at that. Whatever the case, the problem that the Fed was addressing in March of 2020 was the glut of U.S. Treasuries in dealer inventory in February, not the pandemic in March. Duffy leaves out the timing of the problem arising in February. But in any case, let's get back to his paper and see what he proposes in order to solve the problem of primary dealer balance sheets topping out at $250 billion, which is going to be a very huge problem when U.S. Treasuries start rolling off the presses at a rate of $3 trillion a year or whatever it is, just to pay the interest on the debt, as we saw from the Treasury report graphs there. I wonder if Duffy is going to propose scrapping the crony primary dealer system, which, by the way, the Fed calls an open market system. The FOMC, open market, means 24 primary dealers, means the crony system. In any case, let's get over to Duffy. And here he tells us, I review approaches, solutions for backstopping Treasury market liquidity with official sector market function purchase programs. Okay, well, let's be clear. What are his approaches? We need to cut to figure 8. This is really his solution. There are 2 graphs here, A and B. I've animated them into a before Duffys Solution and after. What we are looking at now is the before. Let's punch in on 8B there on the right, because that is really where the action is. And you can see the problem right away. Once primary dealer inventories get to 45%, basically primary dealers become useless because they stop making purchases of treasuries. Their mean rate of purchases drastically declines, it goes down to nothing, and this is a big problem. The question is, what is Duffy proposing to do here? Is he going to get rid of the skim in this system? Is he going to open the system up to more than primary dealers? Oh no, can't do that. Instead, he says, let's just have the Fed come in and the central bank make purchases itself. So once dealer inventories hit whatever, 43, 44%, we'll just have the Fed come in, says Duffy, and just take the inventory off their hands. That's all we got to do. And that way, he says, we'll have just a really smooth market for U.S. Treasuries, easy peasy. That is just totally unbelievable. So let's review what we just saw here. We know from the annual Treasury report that easily $3 trillion in treasuries is going to need to be bought in order to service interest on the debt. But the primary dealers, according to Duffy, can only handle $250 billion before they stop buying. So the solution isn't to get rid of the primary dealer system, it's to put the primary dealers in a nursing home with nurse fed attached to their side with a colostomy bag so that the invalid patient can just continue skimming away and offloading any excesses over 45% onto the Fed's balance sheet. Now, as sick as that level of cronyism is, it's actually not the worst part of Duffy's plan. The real horror in his proposal isn't primary dealers skimming away forever, even though they can't do their jobs. It's having the Fed itself buy new debt from the Treasury. Because if the Fed buys new debt, new U.S. Treasuries, whether it buys through primary dealers or directly, you're going to get inflation, because when the Fed buys things, it creates new money to buy those things. It doesn't reach into his pocket and get that pre-existing money. It creates new money, and that's the problem. The Fed creates new money to buy stuff. And the congressional record from 1947 is absolutely crystal clear on both of these points. So let's look at it. Let's scroll down a bit. We're back at page 95. We need to scroll down. Here we have Eccles again. Question. The statement is made, however, that it is inflationary to permit you to purchase directly, to permit you, the Fed, to purchase treasuries directly from the government. And Eccles answers, direct purchases doesn't matter. He says it is inflationary to permit us to purchase indirectly. It does not make a particle of difference whether we buy directly or indirectly. And that's the sum total of that. So that's really part one. Point one, doesn't matter whether or not the Fed goes through primary dealers or not, has the same, let's cut back to the chart of the quote over here. It has, he says, the same inflationary effect either way. You get the same inflationary effect as long as the Fed, which is creating new money, is buying directly or indirectly new treasuries from the government. You're going to have inflation, same inflationary effect. Whether they go through the dealers, that's just a stop. That's just a stop. That's just a giveaway of commission. The real question is, what exactly is the inflationary effect going to be with Duffy's plan, given what we know from the annual Treasury report in terms of the huge volume of U.S. Treasuries that are going to be needed to make the interest payments? Remember that Duffy's plan hinges on the Fed making all purchases of new U.S. debt that's coming due in that huge ramp in that graph. The question is whether that will be inflationary. Duffy actually, throughout his paper, as I mentioned, never uses the word inflation. Eccles, by contrast, is pretty clear about what's going on here. This is page 35 of the testimony. It's Eccles again, who's testifying. It's a long quote, so I'm going to take it in steps. But here's what Eccles has to say. If you purchase the securities from the Treasury directly or indirectly, as we saw, Eccles himself said it doesn't matter one way or the other. what's important is it's the Fed buying securities from the government. And then he specifies what kind of securities. He says that is new financing, new securities. Okay. So you got the Fed buying directly or indirectly, new financing, new debt, new securities. Here's what's going to happen. Okay. You would add to the deposits of individuals and corporations on the one side of the balance sheet, meaning the liability side of commercial banks, because that's where individuals and corporations have their money. And then, of course, on the asset side, it would show up as idle or excess reserves in the Federal Reserve banks. He says, here's the thing. If you do this, if the Fed buys new debt from the government, here's what's going to happen. It's a perfect instrument of inflation. So here we go. Federal Reserve buying new securities from the Treasury gives you a perfect instrument of inflation. That's the equation. Federal Reserve buying new debt from the Treasury, one way or the other, gives you perfect instrument of inflation, which is exactly what Duffy is proposing. He's proposing that the Fed buy up the entire ramp shown in an annual report. So let's review what we've seen here through a series of graphs. What we've seen is a three-step inflationary spiral. Number one, new debt is up due to the Fed's higher interest rates starting in 2022. We saw that in the annual U.S. Treasury report. Number two, Fed buys up all new debt, over 45% of dealer inventory, which basically means all new debt because dealer inventory only goes up to about $250 billion when you have trillions after trillions coming online. That's Duffy's plan. Have the Fed buy all that new debt. Three, the Fed's purchase of new debt, according to Eccles, is the perfect instrument of huge inflation. And this, by the way, drives the debt higher, putting us back at step one, wash, rinse, repeat. Now, how does this threaten financial liberty, aside from the obvious, which is it's going to reduce your purchasing power so much that it's going to be difficult to buy food? But there's another problem. Central banks have made no secret of their lust for digital currencies. And central bank digital currencies, make no mistake about it, can be used to reduce inflation simply by debiting people's accounts, debiting their CBDC accounts directly at the Fed. And if you think that plan for straight-up confiscation is pie-in-the-sky speculation on my part, I urge you to go to about the 14-minute mark of a video I did about what I call Sticky Fingers Omarova, an Ivy League law school professor, Sala Omarova. She's an admitted discount retail merchant thief whom Biden appointed to head up the entire U.S. banking system. Appointment didn't go through, but that's who he appointed to head up the banking system. You can't make this stuff up. Professor Sticky Fingers wrote a law review article proposing, quote, debiting universally held Fed accounts, end quote, to deal with inflation if and when the time comes, and that time is coming fast. Now remember, Federal Reserve banks that actually issue money and actually would issue CBDCs, they're private entities, private institutions, as opposed to the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, which is public, but which issues $0 every year. Do you want private bankers with no transparency and no accountability to decide whose CBDC account to debit in order to stop the inflation that they created? Yeah, I don't either. But that's what's coming big time if we get the massive inflation that's Trojan horsed inside of Duffy's plan and CBDCs go through. On that foul note, I rest my case. There are ways out of this mess, but that is a topic for another video. For now, thank you so much for listening today, and thanks to Catherine Austin Fitz for making my appearance here possible.